I never intended to become a local legend. All I wanted was peace, a place to wake up with birdsong instead of alarms, and the kind of silence that sinks into your bones after a lifetime of noise. The lake gave me that. It wasn't large, maybe 20 acres from end to end, nestled behind the pine trees just east of my home, a modest craftsman cabin I'd rebuilt with my own hands after retiring from the Navy's Civil Engineering Corps. The land and the lake came together in one quiet package at a county auction 12 years ago. Most folks didn't even know the parcel had gone up for bid. I did because I had kept my ear to the ground ever since the base transferred me back inland. The property had been deemed surplus after a long-abandoned logging company relinquished its rights. I had the deed stamped and sealed with water rights attached. That lake was mine in the eyes of the law, and more importantly, in the rhythm of my soul. In the early mornings, I'd sit with a thermos of coffee on my dock, the mist rising over the still surface like a curtain. Egrets tiptoed through the shallows. Dragonflies skimmed across the water. In spring, a family of geese nested near the western edge, and I'd watch their goslings take their first wobbly paddles. There was a harmony there that no HOA meeting could manufacture, and no city zoning board could replicate. My house stood just outside the perimeter of the newly developed community, Willow Crest Estates. I wasn't part of the HOA, and I had no intention of ever joining. That was made explicitly clear in my property boundaries and in my conversations with the original developers. I was a neighbor, yes, but not their subject. And for the better part of a decade, we coexisted just fine. The homeowners were mostly young families or retirees like me, grateful for the quiet, respectful of boundaries. But things changed last year. The first sign came quietly, as these things often do. A folded newsletter tucked into my mailbox, unsigned and unsolicited, announcing the appointment of a new HOA president. Her name was Karen Littlefield, and she came with buzzwords like community enhancement, shared spaces, and revitalizing underused amenities. It struck me as the sort of fluff corporate types use to justify overreach. I didn't think much of it until I saw the flags. Tiny orange survey flags started appearing near the tree line right where my property met the public access path. At first, I assumed they were utility markers, but I hadn't requested any service. Then came the stake markers. Then the white chalk outlines across the gravel path I'd built myself to reach the lake from my back porch. I called the county office. They confirmed no permits had been filed, no inspections scheduled, no public projects planned. Something was off. 2 weeks later, I came home from a supply run to find a backhoe parked 20 feet from my dock. Workers in neon vests were shoveling sand, literal beach sand, off the bed of a dump truck and spreading it along my southern shoreline. They'd already cleared several bushes, trampled the nesting site, and laid out plastic lounge chairs like we were opening a resort. I stood frozen grocery bags, hanging from my wrist, the sound of mechanical scoops crashing against the tranquility I had spent years preserving. I approached one of the workers, a young guy no older than my nephew. "You got a permit for this?" I asked. He shrugged. "Ask the HOA. We're just doing what we were hired to do." I told them to stop. He ignored me. I repeated myself more forcefully this time. Still nothing. So I walked over to the backhoe and yanked the key from the ignition. That got their attention. Phones came out. Some threatened to call the cops. I welcomed the idea. That evening, I finally met Karen Littlefield in person. She drove up in a luxury SUV, late model, bright red, with chrome accents that practically screamed, "I'm in charge." She stepped out like she was walking onto a stage, big sunglasses, clipboard, and an air of entitlement that hit me like a slap. "You must be Mr. Langley," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "That's right," I said. "And you're trespassing." She made a show of looking around. "Actually, this is part of the common access zone now. Our records show the lake is within the boundaries of Willow Crest's recreational development overlay." I laughed once, dry and sharp. "Your records are wrong. I own this land. And the lake." Her lips tightened. "Well, our developer's maps don't mean squat unless they're stamped by the county registrar and signed by a judge. Which they're not. I've got the deed." She waved a hand dismissively. "We'll sort that out. In the meantime, we're building a small community beach. It'll add value to everyone's property, including yours if you're smart." I looked over her shoulder at the mess they'd made. My dock half buried, the geese long gone, the water line disturbed. I didn't spend 20 years serving this country to be told by a clipboard that my home is up for public use, I said, voice low. She frowned, clearly not used to being challenged. This isn't personal, Mr. Langley. It's policy. Well, this policy is illegal. She turned to leave, then take it up with the board. I did one better. That night, I pulled out the file cabinet from the closet and laid it across my kitchen table. Every map, every plat, every official letterhead I'd collected over the last 12 years. I called my attorney in the morning, the same one who had handled the purchase. By noon, we had the county recorder's verification. By the end of the day, I had a certified letter drafted demanding a full stop to all unauthorized activity. But I knew this wouldn't end with a letter. People like Karen didn't back down. Not when they'd already printed flyers, posted photos online, and started calling it Willow Beach. Not when she thought she could win through sheer arrogance. I wasn't afraid of conflict. I just preferred peace. But if it was a war she wanted over my lake, she had no idea how ready I really was. Karen Littlefield didn't just walk into Willow Crest Estates, she arrived like a storm with glossy nails and an agenda. Before her, the HOA had been run by a loose collection of retired school teachers and quiet types who mostly cared about garbage pickup and mailbox maintenance. They weren't perfect, but they didn't try to colonize the land that wasn't theirs. Karen changed that. She was the kind of person who thought rules were for other people unless she wrote them. She came from the city, from one of those master-planned communities where everything was regulated down to the color of your mulch. She called herself a community strategist. I called her trouble in heels. From the moment she became HOA president, things started to shift. Suddenly, everyone had to repaint their shutters. Trash cans had to be hidden out of line of sight. She went after one man's boat because it was parked too visibly on his own driveway. People grumbled, but no one fought back. She used their silence like consent. The problem was, Karen didn't know boundaries literally or figuratively. What started as nitpicky rule changes inside the HOA rapidly turned into outward expansions. Her big project that summer was reclaiming underutilized community space. What she meant was my lake. She started floating the idea during HOA meetings, most of which I wasn't even invited to, because again, I wasn't part of the HOA, but the gossip spread quickly. Karen wanted to turn the lake into a shared beach zone. She called it a transformational amenity. At first, people were skeptical. They knew that part of the lake didn't belong to the HOA, and more than a few of them had heard about me, the guy who lives on the far end, the one who built his own dock. But Karen was persuasive. She talked in circles using phrases like communal assets and natural boundaries, insisting that the HOA had historic use rights, even though they hadn't set foot near the water until she arrived. And slowly she started convincing them. A couple of families even donated funds for beach enhancement. They had no idea they were financing a land grab. I caught wind of it through one of the more decent residents, an older woman named Martha, who walked her golden retriever past my fence every morning. One day, she waved me over and asked in a whisper, "Are you really going to let them build that beach, Sam?" "What beach?" I asked. She looked surprised. "Karen says they're breaking ground next week." I stared at her. "Breaking ground where?" She pointed. "Your shoreline." I laughed. I didn't mean to, but it burst out of me sharp and humorless. That woman's lost her damn mind. Martha looked uncomfortable. She said the HOA board found old documents, that the lake's perimeter falls within community property lines. "No, it doesn't," I said flatly. "I have the original boundary survey. The county certified it." "Well," she said, sighing, "you might want to show up to the next HOA meeting." So I did. It was held in the clubhouse, a pretentious name for what was essentially a big shed with folding chairs and bad coffee. I wasn't technically allowed to vote, but I could attend as a concerned neighbor. I walked in wearing jeans and a flannel shirt, and you'd think I'd brought in a stray coyote from the looks some of them gave me. Karen was already up front, standing next to a blown-up poster board rendering of what looked like a family-friendly beach resort. There were palm trees drawn in, even though we lived nowhere near the coast kayak rentals, a snack shack, even lifeguard chairs. And this, she was saying, tapping the board with a long pink fingernail, will not only increase property values, but give our children a safe, walkable, recreational area during summer months. She beamed. The board clapped politely. A few people even smiled, clearly bought in. I raised my hand. Karen's smile dimmed, but she acknowledged me. Yes. Mr. Langley, is it? It is, I said. And I have a question about this beach. Whose land are you building it on? She didn't hesitate. The community's. I stepped forward. That's funny. Because the portion of lakefront you've staked is on my property, which is not part of Willowcrest and never has been. Karen's voice hardened. The board has reviewed planning documents. So have I interrupted. Except mine are the official ones, county registered. I suggest you stop digging before you hit a lawsuit. That stirred murmurs. Karen tilted her head and gave me a smile so fake I could almost see the barcode. Mr. Langley, this is a misunderstanding. We believe the lake naturally flows through our neighborhood and thus according to our charter. Charters don't override deeds, I said. You don't get to take land just because it looks nice on a brochure. Silence. A man in the back cleared his throat. A woman shifted in her seat. Karen stared at me like I was a bug that had crawled onto her brunch plate. If you have legal documentation, feel free to share it with the board. Oh, I will, I said. And with the county attorney. I walked out. The next day, I posted no trespassing signs on every tree lining the southern ridge. I drove stakes into the shoreline and tied surveyor's tape around the dock. I made it absolutely clear that anyone who set foot beyond the public trail would be dealing with the sheriff. I thought that would be the end of it. But Karen wasn't done. She didn't just ignore my warning, she escalated. 3 days later, I got a letter in the mail from the HOA. It was on official letterhead, complete with a phony watermark. It claimed I was in violation of Willowcrest's recreational compliance code, that my property posed a community liability risk, and that I owed $850 in fines for obstructing shared amenities. I nearly choked on my coffee. They were fining me for not letting them steal from me. That's when I knew this wasn't going to be a misunderstanding solved with a few documents and a handshake. This was a full-on siege. And Karen, she was just getting started. I thought I had bought myself a little time. After that sham of a meeting and the absurd fine letter, I expected Karen would at least slow down, maybe check in with her legal team, or try to negotiate behind closed doors. That's what reasonable people did when they realized they were poking a hornet's nest. But Karen wasn't reasonable. 3 mornings after I received the letter, I woke to the distant grind of machinery low, rumbling, and wrong. I threw on a flannel, stepped onto my porch, and there it was. A line of dump trucks. They were crawling down the service path like a convoy tires, chewing up gravel and pine needles, each truck bed loaded high with sand. White beach sand. Not the coarse, muddy mix, native to our part of the state. This stuff was trucked in from somewhere warm and coastal, no doubt costing HOA dues, that most residents had no clue were being burned. It looked like an invasion, and that's exactly what it was. The trucks pulled up to the edge of my lake and began dumping load after load onto my shoreline. 5 workers, none of whom I recognized, hopped out with rakes, bobcats, and shovels. They were leveling the sand into neat rows, like they were frosting a cake, pushing it right up to the waterline, covering over wild grass, cattails, and the last signs of the goose nest I'd been quietly guarding for months. I walked down the hill, fast, heart pounding. "Turn it off," I shouted. One guy in a fluorescent vest glanced up, clearly startled. "We're just following orders." "Whose orders?" "The HOA." He pointed vaguely toward the neighborhood, as if Karen might be watching from a tower. "This is private property," I barked. "You are trespassing. You've already destroyed part of a protected riparian zone. Stop right now." He hesitated. "You need to talk to the lady who signed the work order." I didn't need to. I already knew who had. But I pulled my phone out anyway and started recording. "This is Samuel Langley," I said clearly into the camera, pointing behind me. "I'm on my property county parcel number 80466C. Deeded and registered since 2012. I am filming an active violation of trespassing, destruction of private property, and unauthorized alteration of a freshwater shoreline. These individuals have been told to cease activity and are proceeding anyway." The workers stopped. One of them looked uneasy. Another threw down his rake. "Man, I don't get paid enough for this," he muttered, walking off toward his truck. That's when Karen herself arrived. Not in a discreet way, of course. She rolled up in that ridiculous red SUV stereo, thumping like she was pulling into a pool party. She stepped out wearing oversized sunglasses, white linen slacks, and because of course, flip-flops. As if she was already lounging on the beach, she hadn't finished stealing. "Sam," she said with false cheer, "you're making this harder than it needs to be." "Get off my land," I said, voice tight. "Oh, don't be dramatic," she waved. We're just finishing the first phase of development. The community's thrilled. You should see the messages I've gotten." I didn't respond. I was staring at her car and the logo on the side of the door. Not a company. Not the HOA. Just 3 words in vinyl. Karen Littlefield, Realtor. That's when it clicked. She wasn't building this for the community. She was building it to sell homes. Karen had listed several new properties along the Eastern Ridge, all labeled lake adjacent with beach access. That fake beach wasn't for Willow Crest's families. It was a marketing gimmick, a backdrop for glossy real estate photos. She was profiting off my lakes and my land, and she didn't even try to hide it. "You're committing fraud," I said quietly. She laughed short and sharp. "You can't own a lake, Sam. It's water. It's for everyone. Tell that to the county assessor's office. They seem to think otherwise." She stepped closer, her perfume cutting through the clean pine air. "You don't want to do this. You're retired. Alone. Do you really want to pick a fight with a board and a developer with lawyers?" I stared at her, letting the silence hang like a blade. Then I took a deep breath. "I spent 30 years building underwater pipelines for the Navy," I said. "I've been in international litigation over water rights. I've handled disputes in 3 continents, including with oil companies and foreign governments. You think I'm afraid of a real estate agent with a fake beach and a clipboard?" Her smile faltered. I stepped back, still recording. "Last warning. Remove your men, your sand, and your lies, or I'll remove them myself." She didn't reply, just turned on her heel, shouted something in the direction of the trucks, and stormed back to her SUV. She peeled out in a spray of gravel. The workers left 20 minutes later, most of them packing up silently, avoiding eye contact. But the damage was done. They'd dumped tons of sand into a sensitive shoreline, compacted the soil, killed a nesting site, and destroyed a third of my vegetation. I called the county, filed a formal complaint. Then I called the state's Department of Environmental Protection. They had a tip line for freshwater ecosystem abuse. And then I called her listing agency. No one was going to steal my land and smile for a flyer about it. That night, I stood by the dock, looking at the mess. The sand was still there, glistening under the moonlight. The water rippled against it awkwardly, like the lake itself was confused. I knew this was only the beginning. Karen wasn't the kind of person to retreat. She would dig in, twist the rules, and double down. But what she didn't know was that I had more than a camera and a few signs. I had the law. I had the engineering. And I had a plan. The next HOA meeting was packed. Word had spread faster than I expected. Whether it was the workers telling their side or neighbors curious about the sand suddenly showing up on community property, or just bored retirees looking for drama, it didn't matter. Every folding chair in the clubhouse was filled with some folks standing along the walls. I walked in wearing my navy ball cap and carrying a manila folder thicker than a Bible. I hadn't come to play defense, not anymore. Karen was already seated at the front of the room. Legs crossed, smile pasted on like it had been painted there. She wore that same white outfit she liked to parade around in when pretending she was on vacation, rather than in a small suburban neighborhood drunk on power. She saw me and offered a curt nod. I didn't return it. The meeting opened with the usual pleasantries, treasurer's report announcements about lawn standards, a reminder about parking limits on the weekends. The tension was so thick you could feel it buzzing beneath every word. And then Karen stood. "I'd like to introduce the next phase of our Community Enhancement Initiative," she said, turning to the easel with a smug flourish. She flipped the board, revealing a new rendering, the lakefront beach now populated with cartoon children playing in the sand, colorful umbrellas dotting the shore. In the top corner, a fake quote in cursive, "Our lake is finally for everyone. A Willow Crest resident." I'm proud to announce that we've made great strides in revitalizing a previously neglected area, she said, beaming. The new beach has already added visible value to neighboring homes, and we're anticipating an increase in HOA property values by as much as 12%. Murmurs of approval trickled through the crowd. I stood. Karen paused mid-sentence, eyes flicking toward me, like I was a gnat she thought she'd swatted. "I have a statement," I said clearly, "and documents I think this board and this community deserve to see." Karen's smile twitched. "Mr. Langley, as a non-member, this affects every property owner in this room," I said, "and every dollar this board has spent." I walked to the front, calm but deliberate, and opened my folder on the table beside her easel. I pulled out a stack of copies and passed them to the nearest board member, instructing them to pass the rest down. A few residents leaned in, trying to read over shoulders. This is a certified copy of my deed, issued by the county registrar in 2012, I said. It includes full ownership of parcel 80466C, which contains not only my house and dock, but the entire southeastern shoreline of the lake. A few gasps rippled through the room. I flipped to the next page. This is a land survey conducted by O'Neill Engineering in 2015. Independent verification confirms the same boundaries, no public access granted. Flip. This is a letter from the Department of Environmental Protection, opened this week after I filed a complaint. They're investigating the HOA for illegal shoreline modification and potential destruction of a protected nesting site. Now the room was silent. Karen stepped forward, lips tight. Sam, I think you're misinterpreting the... I'm not done, I cut in. I held up one last sheet, an enlarged map stamped in blue ink. And this is the final plat map filed with the county. There is no recreational overlay. There is no shared access zone. There is only your arrogance, Karen, and your fantasy that because something looks good in a brochure, it must be legal. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. I turned to the room. I've tried to handle this quietly. I've sent warnings. I've filmed the destruction. I have wildlife officials now watching the site. And yet, despite all of that, this board approved spending community funds on an illegal project, which means every single one of you could be on the hook financially and legally. People were shifting now. Someone stood near the back. Wait, are you saying this could lead to a lawsuit? It already has, I replied. I've filed an injunction with the county, and if you continue construction or continue trespassing, I'll escalate. Karen's voice broke through, brittle and loud. This is outrageous. We have historical usage rights. There are photos from years ago showing kids swimming there, which doesn't grant you legal access, I said. If someone walks across your lawn for 10 years, that doesn't make it a sidewalk. Another voice piped up, a man I recognized from down the street. Karen, did you know this when you hired the contractors? She hesitated. We were acting on advice from who someone else shouted. You told us it was approved. It adds value to everyone's home, Karen snapped, her polished tone cracking. You're all missing the big picture. No, I said quietly, you are. I took a breath, letting the silence settle like a weight. This lake has been here longer than Willowcrest. I've spent the last 12 years protecting it, restoring it, keeping it alive. You didn't ask. You didn't verify. You just built a mirage on someone else's shore and called it yours. The room was still. Then an older woman, Martha, stood up near the side door. I remember when Mr. Langley moved in. He cleaned the trash from that lake with his own hands. He stopped kids from tearing up the bank with dirt bikes. He planted willow trees where the old ones had died. That lake isn't neglected. It's respected. She looked straight at Karen. You don't speak for me. Another man stood, then another. A few folks clapped, not like a standing ovation, but like something cracking open, a slow swelling realization. Karen looked like she wanted to scream. Instead, she grabbed the microphone and hissed, "This meeting is adjourned." Then she left. I walked home slowly under the stars, feeling the tension in my shoulders begin to ease, but only slightly. This wasn't over. Not even close. She was wounded, and wounded people in power are dangerous. But for the first time, I had the community's ear. Now I had to show them what came next. The next morning, a bright orange envelope was taped to my front door, bold lettering in all caps. Notice of continued non-compliance. I didn't even need to open it to know who it was from, but I did anyway. Inside was a letter printed on HOA letterhead, this time, including a special enforcement committee seal that looked like it had been created in Microsoft Word. According to them, I was now accruing daily fines of $250 for obstructing access to community amenities, removal of approved development signage, and this one was rich, aggressive conduct at a public meeting. Aggressive conduct for showing people the truth. I stood there reading it on my porch as the lake shimmered behind me, feeling my pulse rise with every word. It wasn't just ridiculous. It was tactical. Karen had lost face in public, and now she was weaponizing the HOA's own rules like a sword she hoped would cut me into compliance. But I knew something she didn't. I wasn't just playing defense anymore. That day, I made copies of every document again and added them to a growing folder I'd labeled HOA Escalation Dossier. Then I called my attorney, Julia Merrill, and asked her to meet me at the county clerk's office. She'd handled property disputes before, but when I explained what was going on, she actually laughed. She built a beach on your lake, she asked, eyebrows raised. And then fined me for standing in her way. Julia flipped through the photos, the survey maps, the HOA letters, and finally leaned back in her chair. Well then, she said, let's send her a love letter of our own. We filed a HOA formal cease and desist. That same day, legally binding, notarized, and delivered via certified mail to Karen Littlefield Willow Crest, HOA Board. The letter demanded immediate suspension of all development, retraction of all fines, and preservation of the affected shoreline pending investigation by the County Environmental Review Board. But I didn't stop there. I also submitted a request for public financial disclosures from the HOA. I wanted to see exactly where the money had come from to fund this operation, who approved it, what contracts had been signed, and I CC'd every single board member on the request. That evening, Karen responded not to me but to the entire HOA. A new email went out under the subject line, Urgent False Claims by Lakefront Owner. He wrote, please disregard the disruptive accusations made by Mr. Langley regarding the lakefront project. We have consulted with our legal advisor and believe his claims to be unfounded. This is an attempt to block access to a space the community has enjoyed for decades. Our beach is here to stay. She was gaslighting an entire neighborhood, and yet people weren't buying it. The next day, a younger couple, Tom and Jenny, who lived near the Eastern Trail, showed up at my gate with a pie. An actual pie. We just wanted to say thanks, Jenny said. We didn't realize the HOA didn't have permission. We thought it was official. Tom nodded. If you need people to speak on your behalf, we're happy to. A few more neighbors stopped by over the next few days. Some offered apologies, others brought questions. But what struck me most was how many were clearly afraid to speak too loudly, like they thought Karen might be listening from inside their sprinkler systems. Then came the real punch. On Friday morning, I noticed something odd on the road near my mailbox, a small triangular sign staked into the ground. I walked closer. Property in violation, under review. The sign bore the HOA's emblem. It looked official, meant to scare. Except it was planted outside HOA boundaries, on my land. I yanked it out of the ground and brought it inside, setting it next to the other collection of petty intimidation tactics, envelopes, emails, printed notices, slid under my gate. It wasn't enough for Karen to try and steal the lake. Now she was waging psychological warfare. Create enough paperwork, enough confusion, and maybe I'd get tired. Maybe I'd bend. But I'd lived through worse. After dinner, I sat on the back porch and looked out across the water. The fake beach still shimmered with white sand, but the surface of the lake had gone strangely still. The water didn't reach as far as it used to. The current had slowed. That's when I remembered something. Back when I was rebuilding the dock, I discovered the original stormwater overflow channel, an old concrete sluice system tucked into the hillside near the western edge of the lake. It had been sealed off decades ago with an iron hatch, probably forgotten even by the logging company that once owned the land. I'd restored it out of habit and engineer's instinct. Installed a simple valve system. I had no plans to use it, just figured it might come in handy during flood season. But now it was a lifeline. Because the lake wasn't just water. It was leverage. The next morning, I returned to the HOA clubhouse, not for a meeting, but to post something of my own. I taped a large, laminated copy of my injunction filing to the front doors right next to their community events flyer. I also added a smaller sign. The lakefront is private property. Further trespass or modification will result in immediate legal action. You are being recorded. And I was. I had installed motion-activated cameras around the shoreline. The footage was being stored off-site. I wasn't playing around anymore. Later that week, Julia called with more news. The county's environmental team is opening a formal inquiry, she said. They're sending inspectors next Tuesday. Good, I said. They'll find a beach, and they'll find a mess. Karen must have sensed it because the HOA sent out a new email, this time, panicked and defensive. Due to unforeseen challenges, we are temporarily suspending Phase 2 of the Lake Enhancement Project. We remain committed to building a safe and enjoyable environment for all Willow Crest families. She had blinked, but only just. The fines didn't stop. The threats didn't stop. But the tide was turning. What Karen didn't realize, what she couldn't realize, was that the lake was not a decoration. It wasn't a sales gimmick. And it certainly wasn't hers to claim. It was mine. And I was about to show her just how far I'd go to prove it. By Tuesday morning, the air felt different. Not just because of the overcast sky or the hush that settled over Willowcrest, like the neighborhood was holding its breath, but because something real was finally happening. Something bigger than Karen's rules or my growing folder of paper. The county environmental review team had arrived. They pulled up in 2 government SUVs, tan with county seals on the doors, and stepped out in official vests and boots, clipboard in one hand, cameras in the other. A woman named Teresa Fields introduced herself as the lead investigator. Sharp-eyed, efficient, and all business. The moment she shook my hand, I knew she wasn't there for show. "We received your complaint," she said. "And based on the photos and survey records you submitted, the county has enough cause to initiate a formal site review." Karen must have gotten wind of it, because within 10 minutes she arrived storming down the trail with her phone in one hand and a forced smile on her face. "I wasn't informed the county would be here today," she said brightly, eyes narrowing at me like I had invited the IRS to her birthday party. "Because it's not your land," I replied flatly. Teresa didn't wait for introductions. She turned to Karen. "Are you with the Homeowners Association?" "I'm the president," Karen said. "And this area has been enjoyed by our community for years. It's a valued space for recreation." Teresa nodded. "Understood." "But according to the county records, this land is privately owned and has not been granted public access or development rights." Karen blinked. "We were under the impression." "That impression is not reflected in any legal filings," Teresa cut, in already walking the perimeter with her team. They examined everything. The piles of imported sand, the crushed vegetation, the makeshift fire pit someone had built out of landscaping stones. One of the agents took water samples. Another was photographing what used to be a nesting area now flattened into smooth white nothingness. Karen tried to keep pace with Teresa, offering explanations, making vague gestures toward the lake. "I'm sorry, did you file for a shoreline modification permit?" Teresa asked her bluntly. "Well, no, but we didn't think it was necessary because what, the owner wasn't using it," she snapped, clearly annoyed. I had to turn away to hide the smile on my face. Eventually, Teresa gathered both of us at the top of the slope near the fake beach and made it clear. "You," she said, pointing to Karen, "are not to conduct any further development on this shoreline. If the county finds that this work has disturbed protected habitat or altered drainage patterns without a permit, you could be facing a serious violation. Fines, possibly civil damages. And you," she turned to me, "should secure the property. Consider fencing off the affected area." Karen sputtered. "But this was for the community." Teresa raised an eyebrow. "The community doesn't get to build on land it doesn't own." And that was that. For the first time, Karen didn't have a comeback. No threats, no smiles, no fake HOA jargon. She left. Later that day, I received an email from Julia. "Temporary restraining order approved. HOA may not access your property or continue development until hearing." That alone would have been victory enough, but things kept snowballing. A few days later, I got a call from a reporter with the county press. Someone who had seen Teresa's inspection reports through a public records request. The story practically wrote itself. Lakefront owner battles HOA over unauthorized beach development. By that weekend, it was online with pictures of the ruined shoreline and quotes from Teresa's field notes. The comments were brutal for Karen. And this is why no one trusts HOAs anymore. She built a beach on someone else's lake. Are you kidding? Who gave her the right? Hope she gets sued into retirement. The fallout was immediate. Several board members started resigning. Quietly, of course. Through emails or phone calls. One even knocked on my door to apologize. "I didn't know," he said. "I thought she had it cleared." I believed him. The real twist came 2 days later when a large envelope was slipped under my gate. Inside was a letter handwritten on Willow Crest HOA stationery. "Mr. Langley, I want to express my deep regret for the way this situation has unfolded. While I believed I was acting in the community's best interest, I now recognize that I overstepped. I hope we can find a resolution that preserves goodwill among neighbors. Karen Littlefield." It wasn't quite an apology. It was more like a smoke signal from a ship that knew it was sinking. But I wasn't interested in preserving goodwill. I wanted accountability. So I called Julia and asked her a question I never thought I'd ask. "Can we go further?" She was quiet for a second, then said, "Absolutely." Because what Karen had done wasn't just trespassing. It wasn't just arrogance or bad taste or HOA politics. It was fraud. She used HOA funds dues from her neighbors to commission an illegal construction project on land she didn't own for the purpose of inflating her real estate listings. She had created flyers, listed homes as beachfront, lied in public meetings, ignored legal notices, harassed a property owner, tried to fine me into submission, and if the county wanted to pursue civil charges, I was ready to testify. But more importantly, I wanted her off that board. So I started gathering signatures. I printed out copies of the article, copies of the inspection report, the injunction, and even her own listing ads. I stapled them together with a petition cover sheet. Remove Karen Littlefield as HOA president, effective immediately. I walked the neighborhood personally, door to door. Some folks were nervous, some were tired. But most of them, when they saw the evidence, signed without hesitation. By the end of the third day, I had over 70% of the neighborhood behind me. That was enough. According to Willowcrest bylaws, yes, I had read them thoroughly. A recall election could be forced with a 2/3 majority petition. I dropped the stack of papers off with the remaining board members that Friday. Karen didn't show her face that weekend. By Monday, she was gone. A new interim president was appointed, Martha, the same woman who had first warned me weeks ago. She sent a letter to every homeowner stating that the HOA would cease all development near the lake and that any violations would be remediated per county instruction. They even offered to fund shoreline restoration. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. The beach was still there, ugly and misplaced, but I had something more powerful than sand or signatures now. I had momentum, and I wasn't done. The morning after Karen vanished from her position, I stood by the lake holding a document that weighed heavier than its few ounces of paper would suggest. A final cease and desist. Signed, sealed, and delivered, this time backed not just by my attorney, but also by the county's legal counsel and the Department of Environmental Protection. It wasn't a warning anymore. It was an order. I had printed 10 copies. One for the HOA board. One for Karen if she dared to show her face again. The rest I laminated and posted at regular intervals along the path that ran parallel to the waterline. They read, "Private property, no trespassing. This shoreline is under legal protection. Entry, modification, or use of this land will result in legal prosecution. Kirchhofer County Order No. 42 L307. Verified 2025. It was satisfying in the way only justice can be cold, exact, and irreversible. But I wasn't gloating, not exactly. Because while the cease and desist was the legal nail in the coffin, I knew from experience people like Karen don't go away. They regroup, they whisper. They infect systems with fear and suggestion until they can twist the next thing into their favor. I needed a deeper solution, not just to stop them now, but to prevent them from ever doing it again. So I took a step I'd been debating for weeks. I reached out to the HOA Land and Water Conservation Authority, a division of the state government most people didn't even know existed. But I knew, because I used to brief their federal counterpart during my naval engineering years. I knew the codes, the categories, and the red tape. I scheduled an in-person appointment with one of their regional officers, a soft-spoken woman named Belinda, who wore hiking boots to the office and knew more about marshland law than most attorneys did about murder. I brought maps, photos, the timeline, the environmental violations, the crushed goose nest, and I made my case. I want to convert the lake, I said. Make it a protected zone, official, titled, registered in the state database. Belinda raised an eyebrow. You're willing to give up private recreational rights? I nodded. I'm not using it for boats. I don't lease it. I don't fish it for sport. I just want it clean, safe, wild. She stared at me a long moment, then smiled slowly. You know that would put it out of reach, forever. That's the idea. 2 weeks later, I received the preliminary paperwork. Application for conservation easement with habitat preservation classification. It was the real deal. It meant no more fake beaches, no more fireworks on the shoreline, no more unauthorized development within 500 feet of the water's edge. And the best part, the HOA couldn't challenge it because they had no claim to the land in the first place. While that process churned forward, I made another move more symbolic, but just as deliberate. I repainted the old metal gate at the entrance to my trail. Not to block it entirely, I still allowed access to the public walking path, but to make a point. At the top, in wrought iron lettering, I added, Langley Preserve. Not HOA Park, not Willow Beach, not Community Shores. Langley. The name on the deed. The name on the lake. I even installed a trail cam above it with a sign that read, "Smile. You're on record." Some folks in the neighborhood came by to congratulate me. Others just waved from afar, awkward, uncertain how to reconcile the man they once thought of as that quiet guy on the edge of town with the one who just legally steamrolled their former president. I didn't blame them, but there was still one piece missing. Karen. She hadn't responded publicly, hadn't filed a lawsuit, hadn't even posted to the HOA message board since stepping down. That silence bothered me more than I wanted to admit. So when I got an unmarked envelope in my mailbox, no return address, just my name scrawled in black ink, I opened it with a mix of suspicion and anticipation. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed, no signature. "You may have won this round, Mr. Langley, but you can't stop what's coming. Developers are already eyeing this land. You're standing in the way of progress." I stared at the note, then at the lake. The breeze was light, the water glassy, the reeds whispering in the wind. They didn't understand. This wasn't about winning. It was about protecting. I folded the letter once cleanly and dropped it into the fire pit. Watched the flame curl its edges into nothing. Because while Karen might have gone quiet, the game she played was still out there. Developers, boards, planners, speculators. People who saw land not as a living thing, but as leverage. So I doubled down. I added another layer to the conservation filing public education access. A clause that would allow school groups, nature clubs, and veterans organizations to host seasonal visits, learning tours, and environmental cleanups. I called it Healing by the Lake. And once it was finalized, the lake would be untouchable, not just by Karen, but by anyone who came after her. Later that month, the county posted the ruling in the local newspaper. Langley Lake declared private conservation easement protected under state law. There it was, in black and white. And with that, I issued one final cease and desist this time, not to a person, but to the idea that someone else could dictate the value of what I had built, protected, and loved. No more lies, no more threats, no more beach. Just the lake, as it had always been. They didn't listen. Even with the cease and desist order posted, the cameras installed, the conservation filing moving forward, and Karen publicly disgraced some people in the HOA, still thought they could push back. Maybe they figured I was bluffing. Or maybe they were just used to people folding under pressure, especially when they smelled money nearby. Because that's what this was really about now. Money. Karen had laid the foundation, but her allies were already whispering behind her. One of them was a man named Paul Enright, a so-called developer liaison who'd started attending HOA meetings as a guest. Word spread that he'd bought a few lots along the ridge and was lobbying to restart the beach project properly this time. It didn't matter that the land wasn't theirs. It didn't matter that the county had ruled. They were already drawing new lines on imaginary maps. One morning, I caught a surveyor walking the perimeter again this time, with a clipboard marked Phase 2 Shoreline Assessment. When I confronted him, he just muttered that he was contracted by Enright Properties and that the HOA granted preliminary access. I laughed. The HOA doesn't own this dirt, or that water, or those trees. They don't even own the sand they dumped here last month. He shrugged. I just followed the job sheet. That was it. I didn't call the sheriff. I didn't file another complaint. I walked straight to the west edge of the lake and unlocked the old steel gate buried beneath the ferns. It groaned open with a kind of ancient defiance. The padlock fell into my hand like a silent ally. I had built this drainage system years ago not to weaponize it, but to protect against future floods. The lake sat several feet above the original floodplain, and during heavy spring rains, the excess had nowhere to go. So I'd reconnected the old sluiceway, reinforced the gate, added a manual pressure valve, and sealed the rest in concrete. I knelt down and turned the crank. It took effort. The rust had crept in from seasons of disuse, but the system still obeyed me. There was a sudden low rumble, a gurgling hiss, and then movement. A long, slow suction that began to pull water toward the dark opening. At first, it was subtle, a ripple, a tiny swirl along the far edge of the shore. But by sunset, the lake had begun to fall. The following day, it was visible. The fake beach, the one Karen had dumped $10,000 of HOA funds into, no longer touched the water. There was a good 3 feet of dry, cracked silt between the edge of the sand and the shrinking shoreline. Deck chairs leaned awkwardly. A kayak that had been tied to a decorative post now lay tilted in the mud. Neighbors started to notice. "Is something wrong with the lake?" one woman asked me from her garden. "Nope," I replied, "just giving it time to breathe." Within 72 hours, the transformation was undeniable. What was once a peaceful blue oval was now a basin of exposed sediment, with stubborn pools collecting in the deeper middle section. Fish darted through the narrowing streams. Ducks stood on patches of damp earth that hadn't seen sunlight in years. The waterline receded by more than 6 feet. And Karen, she returned. Of course she did. She showed up unannounced, storming across the flattened beach like she still owned it, arms flailing, voice already raised before she even saw me standing by the dock. "You've drained the lake," she screamed. "No," I said calmly. "I've restored its natural floodplain." She stomped closer. "You can't do that. You're ruining everything." "What exactly am I ruining? Karen, the illegal beach, or the illusion that you ever had any control here?" She pointed toward the shoreline like she was presenting a crime scene. "This is vandalism. You're destroying a shared amenity." I pulled a folded document from my jacket pocket, the conservation application already stamped by the state. "This lake is now under official review for protected easement status," I said. "You're looking at a state-recognized ecological zone. You step foot in it again, you'll be dealing with fish and wildlife next time, not me." Karen looked at the paper, then back at the water, what was left of it. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish flung from a net. "This isn't over," she hissed. I didn't respond, because it was. That night, under a sky laced with stars and silence, I walked the edge of the drained lake. There was something raw and almost sacred about it, like I had peeled back a false layer and let the land breathe again. For years I had lived by that lake. I had tended to it, respected it, let it offer me peace after a lifetime of war zones and command chains. Karen saw it as a selling point. Paul Enright saw it as leverage. But I saw it for what it was, a living thing that deserved more than chairs and volleyball nets and realtor signs. So I let it speak. And in its emptiness, it roared. The HOA board sent a final notice the following week demanding a restoration of shoreline conditions. Julia sent them the reply. "Our client is under no obligation to restore unauthorized alterations made by your organization. All modifications were within legal rights as owner and in compliance with state environmental protocols. Any further contact will be considered harassment." After that, the HOA went silent. No more emails. No more fines. No more beach days scheduled on Lake Langley. The water would return eventually. That's how lakes breathe. What mattered now was that the lesson had been written in the mud. And as I stood over the sluice gate, the tool still resting in my palm, I understood something. Sometimes the only way to protect peace is to unleash a quiet kind of war. I knew the moment the real storm hit, not the kind that brewed in the sky, but the kind that brewed in boardrooms and inboxes. The headlines came first, not from some national outlet, but from the Willow County Ledger, a quiet local paper that rarely ran anything juicier than pancake breakfasts and high school soccer scores. But there it was, front page above the fold. HOA's fake beach project faces backlash after lake drained by owner. A second article followed a day later. Environmental violation investigations underway against Willow Crest HOA. The fallout began like a slow leak. A few homeowners filed official complaints with the county, demanding a refund of their HOA dues. Others began posting screenshots of Karen's past emails and flyers to neighborhood forums, highlighting how she'd promised shared lake access and summer family retreats, all built on a lie. It wasn't long before local parents started to ask, "Where did our money go? Who approved this? Why were we never told the beach was built illegally?" And then, then came the day the beach gave way. It had rained that week, heavy rain. Not unusual for late summer in our part of the state, but enough to make the exposed earth soft unstable. The sand dumped and spread without proper compaction or drainage planning had soaked through like a sponge. By Thursday morning, I stood on my dock with a mug of coffee and watched as the entire lower half of the fake beach began to sag, shift, and finally collapse. It wasn't dramatic. Not a landslide, not some Hollywood explosion. It was worse, it was quiet, slow, and embarrassing. The deck chairs tilted and sank into the wet sand like wounded soldiers. The kayak rack listed sideways and toppled with a sad splash. Plastic buckets, old flyers, and a deflated beach ball all slid together into a gray slurry at the bottom of what used to be shoreline, now a shallow pit. And standing at the edge of the mess, wearing a rain jacket that did nothing to hide her panic, was Karen. She screamed, not just once, not just a yelp or a gasp, but a full-throated guttural primal scream that echoed across the lakebed. A sound made of entitlement, crumbling image shattering, and ego imploding all at once. She dropped to her knees in the sand, trying to dig something out a signpost, a banner, maybe even just her pride. But the mud fought back. Her hands were covered. Her white jacket stained her voice, rising into incoherent shouting. A few people gathered at the edge of the trail, watching in silence. No one laughed, no one stepped in, because they all knew. This was the scream of someone who had built their identity on control and just watched it sink into a lake she never owned. I stood still. Let her see me. Let her remember that she had ignored the warnings, dismissed the law, mocked the truth, and now sat screaming in the wreckage of her own delusion. Eventually, 2 board members arrived, both newly appointed, both visibly uncomfortable. One knelt beside her and tried to talk her down. The other walked over to me. "I'm sorry," he said, "for what I asked. I didn't build the beach." "No," he replied, "but we let her." He handed me a folder. The board voted to dissolve the beach committee. All remaining funds will be reallocated for shoreline restoration under county oversight. "Good," I said, "that's a start." Later that day, a tow truck arrived to pull out the half-buried lounge chairs and remove the debris. A team from the environmental department returned to take more photos, document the collapse, and check for any contaminants in the sand. Karen didn't return. Rumor had it she had fled to her sister's home 2 counties over. Her real estate license was being reviewed by the state board. One of her former clients filed a grievance about misrepresentation of amenities. The HOA sent an official letter to all residents. "We regret the events surrounding the unauthorized development along the Langley shoreline. The board acknowledges that serious mistakes were made, and we are cooperating fully with county and state authorities. Moving forward, all actions will be subject to review by an independent ethics consultant." It was the closest thing to an apology I'd ever seen in writing from them. But I wasn't interested in apologies. I was interested in peace. And for the first time in months, it was returning. Neighbors began to treat the lake differently, not as a backdrop for parties or flyers, but as something quiet, sacred, a living place. The sand was removed, the damaged area reseeded. I even caught a few kids tossing stones into the shallows from the edge of the public trail, far from the waterline, but still smiling. One Saturday morning, Martha brought me a gift, a wooden sign she had made herself, carved and varnished with care. It read, "Protected by fire, healed by water, respected by all." I installed it near the path just before the old split rail fence. I didn't drain the lake to destroy something. I drained it to prove a point. That ownership isn't about power. It's about stewardship. And that sometimes the loudest scream isn't the sound of victory. It's the sound of someone finally facing consequences. Karen's scream didn't haunt me. It confirmed something I'd always believed: people who treat others like dirt will one day find themselves buried in it. The weeks that followed were quieter than I'd ever expected them to be. Not just in terms of noise, though. The absence of trucks meetings or Karen's shrill proclamations was a blessing, but in my own spirit. For the first time in months, I didn't wake with a sense of battle forming behind my ribs. I didn't check my security cameras first thing. I didn't review legal filings over breakfast. I sat on my dock again, just like I used to. Hot coffee, cool mist. The lake, though still partially drained, had begun to refill slowly, deliberately. Nature always finds a way to breathe again, once you get out of its way. The willow trees, once trampled by Karen's backhoes and beach chairs, were sending up new shoots. The wildflowers had returned in patches: yellow, coreopsis blue, pickerel weed, the occasional fireweed flickering like a candle against the green. And the geese, they came back too. I found them one morning, a pair nesting near the slope exactly where their home had been destroyed months before. I stood still, heart strangely full. I wasn't sentimental often, but I took it as a sign. The land remembered. The county finalized the conservation easement within 6 weeks. The state followed suit, designating the area as a private ecological sanctuary, with my home now listed as a steward residence, a rare title, and one I carried with quiet pride. From now on, the land was legally protected. No development, no shoreline modification, no HOA enhancements ever. I'd turned what they once saw as a target into something untouchable. It wasn't just revenge, it was restoration. The HOA, now led by Martha and 2 other level-headed residents, held a special meeting. They invited me, not as a member, but as a guest of honor. I declined politely but sent a written statement. You don't have to be on the board to care about the people who live around you. You just have to listen. To respect boundaries, both physical and personal. The lake is no longer a pawn, it's a mirror. And I hope everyone who walks its banks from now on sees something worth protecting, not exploiting. They read it aloud, I'm told, and for once, no one interrupted. Karen. I never heard from her again. The real estate license suspended. Her listings removed. Her name faded from the HOA's website like a smudge wiped clean. Some say she tried to sue the board for defamation and wrongful removal. But with the county's findings, the fines pending against her, and the public record of the conservation ruling, her case dissolved before it started. Poetic, really. The same woman who weaponized paperwork and fake rules was undone by real ones. But the greatest justice wasn't in what she lost. It was in what we regained. Kids started calling it Langley Lake. I never asked them to, and I never corrected them. A small group of veterans from the local VFW offered to help build benches along the public trail. I agreed under one condition: no plaques, no names, no dedications. Just peace. And peace is what I got. Not just for the land, but for myself. I'd spent years thinking retirement meant slipping away. That after service, after sacrifice, you just get quiet and let the world pass you by. But I was wrong. Sometimes life circles back around and asks you to stand again, not with guns or rank or orders, but with memory and maps and stubborn decency. I didn't win because I fought hard. I won because I refused to forget what mattered. Boundaries, truth, dignity. Not just for me, but for every tree bird and ripple of water that trusted me to defend it. And maybe for the folks who lived nearby, too, those who didn't know they needed protecting until the storm had passed. One afternoon in early fall, I stood at the new footbridge we'd built over the drainage sluice. It was a simple thing, wood nails, handrails, carved by a retired carpenter down the street. Martha joined me, a thermos of tea in her hand. Funny how a fake beach gave us something real, she said. I nodded. Funny how collapse sometimes clears the way. We didn't speak for a while after that. Just listened to the birdsong, the rustle of breeze, and the first clear splash of water rising again where it belonged. No signs, no lies, no screams. Just restoration, and the quiet power of a lake that outlived the ones who tried to own it.